Hello and welcome to this episode of Learning with Power. This is episode, I think, 12, part 2 of the episode that I was doing on economics, macroeconomics, and currency evaluation. Okay, so to pick up where we left off last time, to reiterate, gold is not money. For a time it was, but only in the Western world, not in the Eastern world. And so Europe, basically. And if you look at a map, Europe is very small, but that's where gold was money. And Bitcoin is not money either. And the main reason why gold and Bitcoin are not money is because both of them have to be converted into some kind of currency before you can actually use them. I can't bring Bitcoin to a register and say, here, I want to buy something with my Bitcoin. Same with a piece of gold. You can't bring a piece of gold to a register at a store and say, I want to buy something, here's my money. So you can't, it's not convertible. I mean, it's convertible, but you have to convert it first. And so gold is really just a commodity. And its value is based on supply and demand. And ever since 2009, there's been quite a lot of marketing to push gold. And so the demand has gone up. And I've already explained why this marketing has taken place. It does benefit, especially the right-wing agenda, for people to think that the US dollar or the dollars in your wallet are not money, and that you need to invest in gold. But all currency actually is based on credit. It always has been, and it still is. And in fact, in China, they didn't use gold or silver at all as money. It was all these brass cash coins, which obviously the value of the coins was not based on how much brass was worth. It was based on the fact that the Chinese government said this is money, and if you counterfeit it, it's death, and people trusted it. Also, another thing about currency valuation is that the value of a currency is not relative to what is not relevant to how strong the economy is necessarily. It's relevant to supply and demand. And there's, of course, the most demand for US dollars, overwhelmingly. And even though there's a lot of people that say, oh, the US dollar is worthless, it's going down in value, and I mean, we're having inflation in this country, no doubt, especially in regards to food costs. But that's mostly because of the cost of distribution has gone way, way up. And part of that is supply chain problems and things like that. But internationally, though, the dollar is stronger than ever. I mean, I was just noticing what the dollar, when I was living in India in 2010, the dollar was about, I think, 42, 44 rupees per dollar. It's in the 80s now. So that's in 10 years. Dollar's about doubled in value in Mongolia too. It hasn't in China because China actually sets the value of their currency to the US dollar. So whatever the dollar does, the yuan does as well. And I think we already talked about that. But what does determine currency value is basically determined by either Moody's or Standard & Poor's, and they're based in London, and then they also have offices in Singapore. Singapore has become the hub of economics for Asia because Hong Kong, ever since Hong Kong was taken over by China. Now when China took over Hong Kong, they were like, two states, one policy. Well, and they always claimed that they weren't going to change any of the dynamics of Hong Kong that made it such a successful, economic hub and port. But of course they did. And so all the banks fled Hong Kong, and now the center is Singapore. Okay, and so the way that they evaluate currency is based on, a lot of these things, that we talked about before. And it's also, in a way, it's sort of the way that a broker at a bank determines your credit worthiness. So it's not just your credit score, but it's things like how much income do you have, what are your debts, you know, how much of a debt service do you have to pay each month, and your credit history. You know, have you ever borrowed this much money before? How did you pay it back? You know, all those things are all taken into account. And also, like, what assets do you have? I mean, maybe you don't have much income, but you own 3 houses outright with no mortgages or something like that, you know, that you could put up as collateral or something. So those are the sorts of things that they look at with countries too. So you look at it with a country, you say, well, do they have a lot of natural resources? You know, do they have a lot of, like in Mongolia, for example, they had a lot of copper. They have actually the second largest copper mine in the world is right there in Mongolia. And with copper also comes gold. And so they have a little bit of gold there too. And a lot of coal as well. And so that obviously, for a country of only 3 million people, having the second largest mine like that, such a big mine, means that, you know, the amount of commodities, the amount of assets that they have in terms of underground commodities, which are of course not worth as much as commodities that have already been taken above ground and are refined, but still, it's much more than, you know, it's a very high ratio relative to the population. And those sorts of things are taken into account. Unfortunately, there's other issues that they have that keeps their currency kind of low. But and that's just an example. And mainly, I talk about that currency because that's one that I've actually dealt with personally, because there was a guy named Hans, I don't know if I mentioned it in the last episode, that visited, that was a friend of mine, and he visited Mongolia, and his job was actually to evaluate Mongolian currency. And we actually had lunch while on his trip up there. He's a very tall Hungarian guy, a very nice guy. And we had lunch at a cafe and right on Peace Avenue, and we discussed Mongolia's economics and why I was pitching actually for the value of their dollar to go up, and the main reason why the value of the Mongolian tugrik to go up versus the dollar. And the reason why I wanted it to is because I was living there and I had a lot of tigriks. But, you know, I also was kind of becoming a homer after spending, you know, more than 10 years living in Mongolia. So, but ultimately it's supply and demand. And so, you know, and so they take things like GDP. So GDP is like income. Trade deficits, this is like your debt service, like how many, you know, what's your electric bill? You know, what's your, how much you pay for water, things like that. That's, you know, trade deficit surplus. So we have more income than we have outgoing, just like with a person in a way. And then like copper under the ground or even above ground reserves of assets like coal and things like that, measured in metric tons. And, you know, what are your contracts and relationships with other countries that you deal with? And that includes tariffs and things like that, which are basically taxes that limit a certain country from being able to monopolize certain markets. Okay. As far as what a currency is worth, when you go to like a currency exchange place in another country and you want to trade your dollars in for rupees, let's say, there's another thing that they consider, and that is supply and demand. So the person selling the rupees, you know, has a certain amount of rupees, and there's a certain demand for dollars, and so that affects the supply and demand. And so sometimes other factors can influence what a currency is actually worth at a currency exchange place that isn't actually what the currency is worth on, let's say, Forex, as far as trading internationally. And there's all kinds of factors that go into how it fluctuates and things like that. But for the most part, the US dollar is the strongest currency in the world. Whether Rick at Pawn Stars agrees with that or not, or other libertarians, which he's clearly a libertarian, them's the facts. Okay. And so credit rating is also very important, of course, with currency evaluation. And unfortunately, the U.S. credit rating isn't as high as it could be. It's not AAA plus, it's just AAA. And the reason why is because of the shutdown that happened under John Boehner. And they're, of course, threatening to do that now. And the Republicans always play these games. And that it really should be a criminal offense because it actually damages the entire world's economy when they do that. If America's credit rating is reduced, then the value of the dollar internationally goes down. And so, excuse me, that affects the entire world's economy in not a positive way. Okay. So now, what is gold? Gold is a commodity, and gold used to be the most coveted and most desired commodity in especially the Western world, not so much in Asia or in the Americas, but certainly in the Western world. It was the most coveted commodity until it was basically replaced in the 1800s by oil. And now I think it's going to be replaced by lithium, because lithium, everything, all these gadgets that we use now are all powered, including our cars now, are all powered with lithium. And where did they find possibly the largest deposit of lithium in the world just recently? Well, of course, in the United States. So, you know, the wealthy just keep getting wealthier. And those kinds of things help the value of the dollar, the U.S. dollar. You know, the stronger that the U.S. government is, and the United States is economically relative to the rest of the world, the stronger the dollar is. Aside from the fact that it's the world reserve currency. Okay, so gold, you know, the history of gold is that, you know, of course, gold was more valuable than silver in Roman times, but there was a time actually between about between about 800 and about maybe 1150 AD when actually silver became as valuable as gold, but maybe even more so. The supplies of silver just sort of dried up around the world. And coin production went way, way down during that time. And they made as many gold coins as they made silver coins because it was just as cheap. Until in what was called Bohemia, in the 12th century, they discovered what is possibly, I think it's the second largest silver mine in history, right there in Bohemia. And then Bohemia was quickly dominated by the Habsburgs. And that's really what And so the Habsburgs then controlled that mine, and that's really what made the Habsburgs such a powerful dynastic ruling royal family in Europe, you know, for the next 500-600 years, and it's because of that mine. And so the Spanish were very interested in finding more silver for themselves because they wanted to make themselves wealthy compared to the Habsburgs and people like that, and to the British. And so that's one of the main reasons why they went to the New World. And in the 1500s, around 1560, I think, they discovered the Potosi deposit in Bolivia, the Potosi silver mine, which might actually be the largest silver mine ever discovered. We're not sure. I mean, part of the reasons why it's hard to measure exactly how much silver was in that mine is because of the fact that so much of it went down to the bottom of the Caribbean Sea. I guess it was hard for the Spanish to figure out that, gee, you know, in October, maybe we shouldn't be shipping any silver shipments across the Caribbean in October. I don't know, yeah. Maybe that's not a good idea. Yeah. And so we don't know how much was there, but it was very significant. But the thing is with all this silver, what it did was it decreased the value of silver because silver became very available. And also, so around that time, in the 1600s, the early 1600s, in Europe, especially like in Germany, they started making these 1 ounce called thalers, and in the Dutch, the Holland, they were called dollars, D-A-A-L-E-R, and that's sort of the foundation for why we call our currency dollars. And they were like equivalent to like dollar coins. They even made a double thaler. And those coins are highly collectible now with people that like to collect coins and collect silver and things like that. And most of them were made in the 1600s, and they made them up until the early 1800s, when again the dynamics of silver and money and politics in Europe dramatically changed again, basically because of Napoleon. But then they found a lot of silver again in America, in Nevada, and also a lot in Colorado too, as well as gold in Colorado, which is also because they found a lot of copper there, and copper of course also has gold. So that's why they found gold there as well. But most of the silver was in Nevada, but of course it was a tremendous deposit, and this really helped the American economy in the middle 1800s. And by 1876, actually, the United States opened the first stock market exchange, the first internationally tradable stock exchange, in New York Stock Exchange in 1876. And from this year on, the U.S. government, or the United States, has had the highest GDP and the number one economy in the world. And it's not even close. China's very, very distant second. You could argue even Japan is second. But it's about 1/10 the size of America, literally. And don't let anybody tell you differently. Now they also found silver and gold in Mexico and Peru and Chile. They also found some gold. And the Chinese discovered gold around the 1500s, and basically the Portuguese through their colony there, Macau, brought in lots of gold and silver, mostly silver, and so the Chinese started to make these silver tails or whatever they're called, and they were like ingots kind of that you could stack, sort of. I've got one here, right there, and you could, like that, and you could sort of stack them up, and that became very very desirable. Chinese became obsessed with silver starting in the 1500s, but it still wasn't money, really. They just became obsessed with having silver, mainly because it's something that the West had. It's the biggest reason why they wanted it. Okay, so then in 1970, but eventually, as the world became more international, and as commerce became more international, and international trade was starting to develop, and you have the Gilded Era, and you've got these multimillionaires emerging in like Morgan and people like that, and banking in the United States, more and more and more currency became credit-based and needed to become credit-based. And eventually in the 1930s, America went off the gold standard. And actually, England didn't. And because they didn't go off soon enough, it greatly damaged their income, their economy. Which is why in World War II, England was really suffering, and they desperately needed the help of America, because despite massive imperialization that they had done around the world, their economy wasn't that strong because they had remained on a gold and silver standard for too long. That's how important it is to go credit rather than cash all the time. So then and actually gold was illegal to trade privately. So we were so much off the gold standard that it became actually illegal. But in 1971, of course, they made gold legal again under Nixon. And at that time, gold was worth about $35 an ounce. It was obvious that those prices were artificially established and that the prices were going to rise. But even in the so you see these ads. So of course in 1976 the value of gold per ounce was not that high. And so you see these advertisements on TV that says, well, gold in 1976 was only worth this. Today it's worth this. And they don't really tell you the whole story. But in 1980, gold was worth about $200 an ounce. But that was kind of an understandable, expected increase. And so it did increase steadily. And in around 2006, it was worth about $400 an ounce. So it had increased steadily, but it wasn't like it was, the greatest investment in the world. But what happened was, is in 2009, when the economy started to tank and people started to become really desperate and they didn't trust the dollar anymore and things like that, the corporations really took advantage of this situation and they marketed gold like crazy to people who were unsuspected or not very sophisticated, and that they bought into the idea that gold is money, and which of course it isn't. And so they started pitching, marketing gold, and so of course the demand for gold went up, because of the marketing, massive amount of marketing. And they were marketing also to baby boomers, at that time, who in 2009, they were mostly 60 years old, they were retired, and they were worried about, their retirements, Baby boomers have a tremendous amount of economic influence in the United States. Ever since they were born, the hula hoop, Barbie, workout videos in the 80s, as they hit their 30s, later went to investing and healthcare businesses later on. And so they all started buying gold. And the value skyrocketed. It eventually went all the way up to $2,000 an ounce by like 2011. But it's still not higher than that now. So how good of an investment is it really? I mean, it's not. It hasn't continued going because the demand at that time was artificial, kind of like with baseball cards in 1990 and 91. The demand was artificial. And so the market has adjusted. It's still, I think, around $1,200–$1,400 or whatever, but it hasn't, since 11, really for the last, I guess, 12 years, it hasn't really gone up much. In fact, it's gone down and hasn't really recovered. And so that's because still, taking 10 years to get to $200 and then 26 more years to get to $400, it's just kind of a gradual progression. It should be around $1,000 at that rate. And that's a normal inflation. Okay, so all right, so I have socialism versus capitalism. Okay, so let's talk about that a little bit. Okay, so socialism basically is where the government sort of ultimately has the final say on what corporations do. And capitalism is basically unbridled, just let the businesses do whatever they want. And there is no totally capitalist state in the world. And there is no totally socialist state in the world. And there never was a totally communist state in the world, ever. Well, not since, maybe in 10,000 BC there was a communist organization, but not since. And there shouldn't be. I mean, some degree of socialism is necessary. In a way, it gives China an advantage because their corporations can't get too corrupt unless the government thinks it's in their best interest. Whereas in America, the corporations actually dictate to the government what they want. And so everything is controlled in America by corporations. The government basically just answers to the whims and desires of corporations. And so all the people that don't trust the government, well, what they really shouldn't trust is corporations, because corporations are always driven by the bottom line, which is not just profit. That would be fine. If all they needed to do was make a profit every year, we wouldn't have a problem. But because of the fundamental design of the stock market, they need to make growth every year. And that's the problem. So they're constantly looking for ways to cut costs and to increase that growth year on year. And so, okay. I think I covered that before. But corporations don't want any form of socialism because that involves taxation. I mean, there's a lot of taxes in Canada, for example. But of course they have fantastic health care. But corporations want nothing to do with this. They want nothing to do with public transportation. They want nothing to do with anything that they have to pay for that they don't want to pay for. The only thing they want to pay for is new baseball stadiums. But other than that, they don't want anything to do with any other kind of spending because they're trying to create growth, year after year of growth. And so, they attack social services like crazy. You know, socialism is bad. Yeah, you know, look at all the money people are getting in food stamps. Oh, it's awful, you know. That is such a tiny part of the budget of the United States. It's unbelievable. It's like maybe 1 or 2%, you know, versus, you know, like 60%, which is the military budget, things like that. You know, I'm just saying. It's not really a problem. And it's not a problem in Europe. And for all the people that say, well, look at Europe, they're not working, you know, that's why they're having economic problems, because they're socialist and it just doesn't work. You just can't run a business that way. Well, maybe you can't run a business that way, but you can run a country that way. And that's what I'm trying to explain. And actually, it is working. It does work. It just means that corporations have to pay their fair share. And where they pay their fair share, such as in Europe and in China, you have fantastic public infrastructure. So the trains in China are just amazing. They have a fantastic subway now in Beijing, and you can just walk down to the end of your block, jump on a train, the local train in Beijing, which is very clean and very nice and very new and fast and efficient. And it can take you straight to a terminal where you can jump on to the high-speed train and go straight all the way to Shanghai. You can go then from Shanghai all the way to like Kunming or Chengdu or whatever, or Wuhan or whatever. All these places are accessible by high-speed trains, or Shenzhen, Guangzhou, and it's just amazing. So literally from your home, boom, about a block down the street, you can go anywhere in the country faster than if you flew there, if you tried to fly there. People fly in China who have money, and they kind of want to be, you know, they kind of want to say, oh, I flew there. And so actually, flying domestically in China is almost like flying Air Emirates or something. The service is fantastic. Domestically, the domestic air in China is really great. Not like in America, where it's really horrible. And scary almost sometimes. The service is so bad. All right, and so that basically the corporations don't want to pay their share of taxes in America because that affects their ability to create growth and thus create dividends and profits and make everybody that's a shareholder, you know, wealthier. They don't get wealthy by just making a profit. They have to have growth. And so how do you have growth? Well, it used to be that so I was doing the history of currency. Okay, so Portugal, I didn't mention how they got wealthy. In the 1420s, they started to export slaves. And then ultimately, they started to bring them to Brazil. That made them pretty wealthy. And it also made Mali, under Musa, very wealthy because he also had gold. But basically, the reason why he had gold was because he was given the gold by the Portuguese for trading the slaves. Of course, there was also a small gold mine in that area that they discovered. But anyway, but that culture again was built by Europeans. The other issue is, okay, so like in America, so before I get into this, the fundamental problem with the world. Also in America, and this goes back to like I was talking about the libertarians, and they talk about the Fed and all that, and how it's very dangerous, and it's all owned by private banks, and they can do whatever they want. And in a way, that's true. I mean, they are basically private banking institutions that do make up the Fed. They are overseen by Congress, and so they can't just run roughshod and go crazy. And generally, Congress assumes that they're not going to do anything that's not in their best interest. So why would they do something to decrease the value of the dollar when they are the dollar? You know, so why would they hurt themselves? But because it's privately owned, they have quite a lot of influence over policy, government policy, and part of that is our insistence on just being devoted to whatever Israel wants to do. Anything that an Israeli leader wants, we just, yes, we'll follow, we'll support anything you want. And so anything they want to do, we support them with blindly. Blind devotion. And it mainly is because of the fact that the largest debt that America owes, when they talk about balancing the budget and things like that and how bad that is, and we got to balance this budget because we owe all this money and we owe all this money to China. Well, actually, China is our largest foreign, we owe the most money to China than to any other country. But the amount of money that we owe to China is only a fraction of what we owe to the private banks in America. American banking institutions are primarily who we owe the debt to. And so, of course, they're not going to call in the debt. And China, even if they did try to call in their debt, it would hurt us, but it's not that big of a deal. China hopes that it would hurt us, but it wouldn't hurt us that much. And so the fundamental problem, as I said, is with growth. And so how do you continue to have growth? Well, through most of the 1900s, and into 2000, there was always some gizmo or gadget that was invented, the fax machine and internet and CDs and DVDs and just different things, television, flat screen TVs, and then just, it's always some kind of gadget, some kind of new gadget that we kept coming up with that would create this growth. But quite frankly, we're running out of ideas now. And that's really a lot to do with what happened with COVID in 2020, which was exploited. I mean, it was a real disease, but it was exploited to the nth degree by corporations who basically wanted to get rid of customer service. And of course, it hasn't come back, has it? No, we still don't have customer service anymore, right? And so that's what they wanted to do, because that's actually the largest portion of their payroll, their outward expenses that they couldn't control. And they wanted to reduce that. And they did that. Yay! So more growth. But that's the problem, the fundamental problem with the stock market, and the fact that the whole world economy is based on stock markets. And stock markets are all predicated on growth. If they were predicated instead on just profit, that would be a lot more efficient. But they're not. They're predicated on growth. That's the problem, because you can't forever generate massive amounts of growth year after year after year. There's a finite limit to how many inventions that we can come up with. For example, this is why I showed you an example of a spoon before. So I don't have one handy, but I don't want to stop. So let's say I have a spoon in my hand. How much can we improve on that? We're humans. We have mouths. Take the spoon, we eat it, we have to eat. I mean, that's it. You have spoons, there's no more advancement. Humans have limitations, and so there's limitations to inventions and evolving products and things like that. There's a limitation to it. And we're starting to see that now. And so that's limiting growth, and so that's why they have to create growth in other ways, which means squeezing the general public as much as they can squeeze them for. Which is why you personally feel like the economy is not doing well. All right, and until we fix this fundamental problem, it's only going to get worse. Okay, so that's it for this episode of Learning with Power. And this was episode 2 of a 12-part series. Of a 2-part series. This is episode 12 overall. I think I'm getting confused here. And don't forget to like and share, and I think you can subscribe somehow, something like that. Please do that if you like this. And we'll see you next week. I think I'll be talking more about the Israel situation next week. All right. So we'll see you then. Have a good day. Talk to you later.